It was a quiet Sunday evening in the small town of Bridge Hollow, Georgia, a place where everyone knew your name and your faith. That night, the pews of First Grace Baptist Church were full. The air inside the sanctuary was warm with the scent of hymnals and polished oak, and the voice of Pastor Elijah Benton echoed through the room with its familiar blend of calm and conviction. Elijah wasn't just a pastor to Bridge Hollow. He was a pillar, a former soldier turned preacher, a mentor to the troubled, a father to two, and a husband who never missed a dinner prayer. That night, after the benediction, he shook every hand, bowed every head, and turned off the chapel lights himself, like he always did. And then he vanished. No one saw him leave the building. His truck was parked exactly where it had been all evening. His keys were still in the ignition, but he was gone. No footprints, no sounds, no witnesses. The town searched. Police combed the church, the nearby woods, even the riverbank that curved quietly behind the cemetery fence. Search dogs found nothing, and for 40 years, the only memory of Elijah was the echo of his voice and the unanswered questions he left behind. Until now. In March of this year, a construction crew clearing brush near the long-abandoned Elkhorn Cemetery unearthed something unexpected. A worn leather Bible wrapped in plastic and buried beneath a patch of earth that hadn't been touched in decades. The nameplate inside? Reverend Elijah D. Benton. It wasn't just a lost possession, it was a clue, and the first real one in 4 decades. But this Bible didn't just tell scripture, it told a story, one that led investigators, family members, and the entire town of Bridge Hollow back through the decades to a night no one had truly recovered from. What happened to Pastor Benton that night? Why did someone bury his Bible in a forgotten cemetery? And why, after 40 years of silence, does this discovery suggest he may not have left alone? This is the story of a man of faith, a vanished voice, and a mystery buried with time. Until now. On the morning of October 9th, 1983, Bridge Hollow felt ordinary. The rustling of pecan trees lined the sidewalks, and the town's only diner had a line out the door after the early morning service. Church was everything in Bridge Hollow. It wasn't just a place to pray, it was the town's heartbeat. And no one kept it beating like Pastor Elijah Benton. Elijah was the kind of man who remembered every birthday, visited shut-ins weekly, and still somehow found time to coach the local boys' basketball team. Tall, silver-haired, and soft-spoken, he had served as pastor at First Grace Baptist Church for nearly 18 years. He wore a brown wool coat even in the spring, and every Sunday he closed each service with the same gentle phrase, "God's timing is perfect, even when our faith is not." The night of his disappearance had begun just like any other. At 5:30 p.m., Elijah arrived at First Grace. His wife, Lillian, remembered him leaving their house with his usual briefcase and a thermos of black coffee. "Don't wait up. I might stay late to tidy up the office." That wasn't unusual. Elijah was meticulous. Often he'd stay after services to file prayer cards, return phone calls, or prepare for next week's sermon. The evening service began at 6 p.m. Attendance was modest, mostly older members and a few young couples. Elijah preached from the book of James, a lesson on perseverance through trials. He even joked midway through the sermon, even preachers don't get shortcuts through the hard stuff. According to several attendees, Elijah was in good spirits, calm, measured, no signs of stress or distraction. After the service ended around 7:10, he stood at the chapel door, as he always did, thanking people as they exited. Then he was gone. The last confirmed sighting came from Marlene Fitch, the church organist. She had stayed late to organize sheet music and said she saw Elijah walking toward his office around 7:25 p.m. His brown coat was draped over his arm. He gave her a nod, smiled faintly, and disappeared down the hallway. When Lillian awoke the next morning and saw that Elijah's side of the bed was untouched, panic set in. "I called the church, I called the diner, I even drove to the parking lot," she said later. His truck was still there, his briefcase was inside, but he wasn't. The truck was locked. The keys were in the ignition. Nothing inside had been touched. Elijah's coat hung neatly on the passenger seat, and his Bible was missing. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no blood, just silence. Police were called before 9 a.m. Detective Harold Rooks, who handled most local cases, took the lead. "It was eerie," Rooks recalled in a 1984 interview. "He vanished between two breaths of a normal Sunday night. Officers and volunteers fanned out across the surrounding woods. Dogs were brought in. The river behind the cemetery was dragged. Even nearby farms were searched. Nothing. Lillian was questioned extensively. There were no signs of marital strain, no insurance policies recently changed, no hidden conflicts. Elijah had no enemies, no debts, no double life. It was as if the town's most trusted man had been swallowed by the very ground he walked on. Rumors began to ripple through Bridge Hollow by Tuesday. Some whispered that Elijah had simply walked away, overwhelmed by hidden demons or divine doubt. Others claimed he had been abducted by someone from outside the town, a drifter or ex-con who had passed through unnoticed. But for those who knew him, none of it made sense. Lillian refused to believe Elijah would ever abandon her. Their marriage, though not perfect, was steady. "We had our rhythms," she said in a later interview. "He made coffee in the mornings. I baked cornbread on Saturdays. We shared quiet and faith, always faith." The church congregation was stunned. For years they'd leaned on Elijah during their own times of grief. Now they found themselves staring into the very silence he used to speak through. Detective Rooks brought in state investigators by the end of the week. Forensics examined Elijah's truck, the church office, and even the sanctuary floorboards. No fingerprints out of place, no signs of forced entry. Oddly, the only thing truly missing from Elijah's personal effects was his Bible, the old black leather King James version he'd carried since seminary. The edges were frayed, his name embossed in gold on the inside cover. It wasn't just a holy book. It was personal, filled with years of handwritten sermon notes, dog-eared pages, even a few pressed flower petals between psalms. "It was like his fingerprint," said Deacon Allen Mills. "That Bible was never more than an arm's length from him. Why would someone take only that? And why was it never found?" Lillian submitted dental records and provided hair samples in the event remains were discovered. But years passed with no sign, no body, no clue. Church attendance dropped sharply after Elijah's disappearance. A new pastor was eventually appointed, but it never felt the same. The town tried to move on. Sort of. In 1987, a man in Alabama was arrested for impersonating a preacher. He bore a vague resemblance to Elijah and claimed to have visions of a vanished shepherd. For 2 weeks, national headlines flared with theories. But DNA cleared him, and he was ruled out as a fraud with delusions of grandeur. Another false lead. Then there was the anonymous letter sent to Lillian in 1991. It contained a single sentence: "He never left the grounds." Authorities traced the envelope to a post office box in South Carolina, but the account had been opened with a fake ID. The handwriting didn't match anyone in Elijah's circle, and nothing came of it. Still, the phrase haunted her. He never left the grounds. Could it have been literal or spiritual? Lillian kept the letter in her nightstand for the rest of her life. She died in 2003. Her obituary mentioned Elijah by name, calling him her eternal companion, whose voice still echoes from the pulpit. By then, the case was cold, very cold. The local paper printed a 20-year retrospective in 2003. Most people believed Elijah had either died in the woods that night or fallen victim to someone who knew how to make people disappear? No one expected an answer until 2023. After the initial wave of search parties, prayer vigils, and community outreach efforts, the case of Pastor Elijah Benton slowly faded into local folklore. People stopped asking where he went and started wondering why it mattered. Bridge Hollow adjusted the way small towns do, quietly. The church hired a new pastor, but he never stood in Elijah's shadow without being reminded of the one who disappeared. A few parishioners claimed to have heard footsteps in the church late at night or caught glimpses of a tall man in a brown coat walking past stained glass windows during thunderstorms. But those were treated as stories told by those who missed him most. For investigators, though, the mystery had no expiration date. Detective Harold Rooks retired in 1989, but the case haunted him until the end of his life. He kept the original file in a locked drawer at home, Elijah's photo paper clipped to the top, his name highlighted in red ink. When Rooks passed away in 2007, his grandson, Brian Rooks, inherited the file and began a quiet investigation of his own. A state trooper by then, Brian had grown up with the story. He remembered his grandfather sighing over the file late at night, shaking his head and muttering, "It was too clean, just too clean." What Brian discovered over the next decade would only deepen the mystery. First, he revisited the church records and discovered something strange. The night Elijah vanished, the main door logs showed him entering the sanctuary, but not exiting. The system wasn't sophisticated, just a metal clicker tracked by an usher on duty. Still, it was a clue that had been dismissed early on. Brian then interviewed the few surviving congregants who had attended the night service. Most remembered nothing unusual, except one. An elderly woman named Norma Greaves claimed that around 7:30 p.m., just minutes after the sermon ended, she saw a tall man with a book under his arm walking around the far side of the cemetery fence. She thought it odd, but didn't report it, figuring Elijah often walked the grounds in prayer. No one had followed up on that statement. When Brian asked to see the security footage from that night, he learned it no longer existed, taped over years ago. The only photograph from that service was a blurry image taken by a visitor that showed Elijah standing at the pulpit mid-sermon. He was smiling, but it was what Brian learned next that chilled him. The Elkhorn Cemetery, which bordered the church, had been sold in 1991 to a private company for development. That deal fell through, and the land sat untouched for decades, choked by ivy and forgotten gravestones. Brian pulled the property records and discovered the original cemetery deed had once belonged to a man named Lyle Hargrove, a parishioner of First Grace Baptist. But here's the twist. Lyle had disappeared in 1984, 1 year after Elijah. No trace, no news articles, no obituary, just vanished. Brian began to suspect there might be more buried in Elkhorn than tombstones. He petitioned the county for access to the overgrown property, but bureaucratic red tape kept delaying the search. He needed evidence, or something close to it. Then, in the fall of 2022, a weather event struck the town. A windstorm uprooted trees across Bridge Hollow, including a large oak at the far end of the cemetery. When city workers came to clear the debris, they stumbled across something odd. A set of loose stones near the roots, with old wooden boards underneath, and something wrapped in plastic. It was a book. A black leather King James Bible, its cover warped by age, but still intact. The inside flap read, Elijah D. Benton, Romans 8:28. The discovery made headlines across Georgia within 24 hours. The Bible was handed over to authorities for forensic analysis. For the first time in decades, the Elijah Benton case was no longer considered cold. It was officially reopened. The condition of the book told its own story. The pages, although water-stained and crinkled, remained legible. Inside, investigators found sermon notes in Pastor Benton's handwriting, a small photo of Lillian tucked between psalms, and 3 pressed forget-me-not flowers. Most curious of all was a page torn from the back, a single line written in trembling ink. "He walks with me still." Was it a quote from Scripture? A coded message? A final entry? Detective Carla Mendez, now assigned to the reopened investigation, took over the case files. She was young when Elijah vanished, but like many Bridge Hollow natives, had grown up hearing the tale. Now she was staring at the one physical piece of the puzzle that might prove Elijah hadn't wandered off, but had been hidden. She ordered a re-excavation of the cemetery's southeast corner, the area where the Bible was found. That required court approval, and tensions rose in the town. Some believed the cemetery was sacred and should be left alone. Others demanded answers. Permission was granted. Within days, a forensic team uncovered 2 things beneath the collapsed tree line: the remnants of a shallow grave, no body, just a torn piece of cloth, and rusted buttons consistent with 1980s men's formal wear, and several burnt wooden beams, charred, partially buried, not from a coffin, but likely from an old shed or outbuilding that once stood on the site. Blueprints from the 1950s confirmed there had once been a groundskeeper's shack near that spot. But here's where things took an unsettling turn. Inside the remnants of the shack's foundation, investigators found a fragment of a boot sole matching the type Elijah wore. More importantly, nearby was an old rusted key, later confirmed to open a drawer in Elijah's desk, still preserved by the church. Inside that drawer, untouched since 1983, was a folder labeled Confidential, August 15th. That date held no obvious meaning, but inside were copies of handwritten letters, sermon outlines, a list of names. At the bottom, a note that read, "Meet at Elkhorn, after prayers." Speculation exploded. Did Elijah plan to meet someone that night after the evening service? Had he discovered something, possibly about the church, the land, or a member of the congregation, and attempted to confront them? One name stood out from the list: Lyle Hargrove, the missing man from 1984. It turned out Hargrove had served as the church's groundskeeper for over a decade. He was quiet, deeply religious, and kept to himself. But after Elijah disappeared, Hargrove resigned suddenly and moved to a remote cabin in Tennessee. He died in 1996. No autopsy, no heirs, just a local burial and a quiet farewell. Detective Mendez tracked down records from Hargrove's estate. Inside a locked cabinet retrieved from the cabin was a collection of documents: weathered, yellowed pages including journal entries, biblical verses scrawled in haste, and one small note folded dozens of times. It read, "He asked too many questions. I had to answer with silence." The handwriting was a match. While this didn't confirm guilt, it added a layer of dark complexity to what many had assumed was a spiritual disappearance. And yet, there was still no body. No crime scene, just the ghost of a man who never left behind a scream, only Scripture. Still, the discovery shook Bridge Hollow. Church members who were children at the time came forward, some recalling strange whispers they'd heard from their parents. Old records resurfaced, showing a financial discrepancy in the church fund books from late 1983. Thousands of dollars unaccounted for. Elijah had begun asking questions weeks before he vanished. Suddenly, he never left the grounds. Didn't feel like a cryptic message. It felt like the truth. The town held a vigil that November, 40 years to the day after Pastor Benton vanished. They gathered at First Grace, this time not to search, but to grieve, for answers never given, and for a shepherd who had, perhaps all along, known he wouldn't return. The town of Bridge Hollow had lived in the shadow of a question for 4 decades, and now, finally, the pieces, though dusty and weather-worn, were starting to align. Detective Carla Mendez wasn't ready to call it a solved case. Not yet. But she felt they were standing at the edge of the truth. The key was the journal entries found in Lyle Hargrove's locked cabinet. There were dozens of them, most rambling and disjointed, written in moments of what psychologists would later call religious mania. He spoke of cleansing the grounds, judgment under the soil, and watchers in the woods. Some pages made no sense. Others, though, had details only someone close to Elijah could have known. One entry, dated just days before Elijah disappeared, stood out. He saw the receipts. He asked about the children's fund. He wanted to speak before the congregation, but God said no. He speaks too loud. It seemed likely that Elijah had uncovered financial fraud within the church's budget, possibly involving the children's ministry or maintenance funds. In 1983, such a discovery would have sent shockwaves through a close-knit conservative community, especially if it involved long-standing members like Hargrove. But why bury the Bible? Why hide it rather than destroy it? That's where things got even stranger. During a re-excavation of the Elkhorn Cemetery's perimeter, investigators found remnants of a second plastic bag inside a rusted drain pipe. Inside were 3 torn pages from a 1982 sermon marked with red ink. Across the margins, Elijah had written notes, thoughts, questions, even a single scrawled sentence. "If I don't make it to Sunday, remember Romans 8:28. Romans 8:28. The verse found inscribed inside the returned Bible. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." This wasn't just scripture. This was Elijah's message. His faith, unshaken, even in fear, had become his final testimony. Carla, now convinced this was no accident, pushed for a deeper investigation into church leadership at the time. She subpoenaed old financial records, interviewed retired deacons, and even tracked down a few surviving board members. What she uncovered was a pattern of small, undocumented withdrawals from the church's account between 1981 and 1983, amounting to just under $20,000. One man's name kept showing up: Charles Denman, a former assistant pastor who had quietly relocated to Florida shortly after Elijah's disappearance. When contacted by authorities, Denman initially refused to speak, but under pressure he agreed to a phone interview. He didn't deny the financial mismanagement, but when asked directly whether he or anyone else had been involved in Elijah's disappearance, Denman went silent for nearly a minute. Then he said, "He was going to split the church in 2. He didn't understand. Some truths need to stay buried, but I didn't kill him. I swear to God I didn't." It was a chilling half-confession, enough to implicate involvement, at least by omission. Carla passed the case file to the DA's office, but without a body. The statute of limitations complicated any potential prosecution. Denman died 6 months later from heart failure. No charges were filed. Yet something even more unexpected was about to surface. 2 weeks after the story aired on local news, an anonymous envelope was dropped off at the sheriff's office. Inside, a photograph. Old, faded, clearly taken with a film camera. It showed a clearing in the woods behind Elkhorn Cemetery. In the center was a cross, wooden, makeshift, driven into the earth. At its base, Elijah's Bible. And behind it, barely visible in the shadows, was a man, wearing a coat, tall, solemn. The note on the back read, "He never really left us." For some in Bridge Hollow, it was proof of something spiritual. For others, it felt like closure. For Carla, it raised even more questions. Who took the photo? Why was it sent now? And if the Bible was found buried years later, when was this picture taken? It seemed the story wasn't finished. Not yet. The photo ignited a firestorm. Locals flooded the sheriff's office with theories. Former congregants, journalists, even amateur sleuths pored over the blurry photograph. Some swore the cross in the clearing hadn't existed before the 1990s. Others believed the entire photo was fabricated, an elaborate hoax to stoke interest in an unsolvable case. But for Detective Carla Mendez, the photo was something else entirely, a breadcrumb. She dispatched a drone crew and forensic archaeologists to comb the surrounding woods behind the Elkhorn Cemetery, focused on trying to locate the area seen in the picture. It wasn't easy. Decades of overgrowth, storms, and erosion had transformed the forest floor into a maze of tangled roots and shadows. But after days of scanning, a slight clearing was located northeast of the original burial site. They began to dig. What they found buried 3 feet beneath the moss-covered soil wasn't a body. It was another wooden cross, rotted and collapsed, and beneath that, a stone box. Inside, a time capsule, handmade, water-sealed, and unmistakably intentional. Inside it were 5 items: a faded church bulletin from August 14, 1983, a small hymnal bookmarked on "Be Still My Soul," a photograph of a young Elijah Benton with his arms around his youth group, a pressed forget-me-not, identical to the ones found in the Bible, and a cassette tape, labeled in careful handwriting, "For whoever still believes." The sheriff's office quickly set up analog equipment and played the tape in a secure room. Static burst through the speakers at first. Then, slowly, a voice emerged. It was unmistakably Pastor Benton. He sounded calm, collected, but the weariness in his voice betrayed something deeper. August 14th, 1983. This is Elijah Benton. If you're hearing this, I didn't make it. I need someone to understand why. What followed was a 19-minute message recorded, presumably the day of his disappearance. He recounted concerns about church finances, leadership secrecy, and a confrontation he anticipated that night with unnamed individuals who had buried truth beneath the altar. "I never stopped believing in grace," he said softly toward the end. "But some men confuse power with faith, and when you challenge power, it doesn't pray back." The tape stopped there. No click, no final goodbye. But it was enough. Enough to prove he feared for his life. Enough to show he'd tried to preserve the truth. The media caught wind quickly. Within 48 hours, news stations across the country were airing stories titled "The Tape from the Grave" and "Pastor's Voice Returns 40 Years Later." Parishioners, some of whom had never believed Elijah was truly gone, gathered once more at First Grace Baptist. Candles lined the altar, old sermons were read aloud, and the tape played over the speakers one last time before being archived by the state. One question, however, still remained. Who buried the box? It had to have been someone Elijah trusted, someone who had access to the tape and had the foresight to preserve it, someone who might have known he wasn't coming back. All signs pointed to Lyle Hargrove, but he was dead, and the mystery of his relationship to Elijah, mentor, rival, friend, was never documented. Then came a final twist. An elderly woman, Martha Kinney, came forward after seeing the broadcast. She was in her 80s now, a former cleaner for the church, and claimed she had overheard a conversation days before the disappearance. It was between Hargrove and Elijah, heated, intense, but what she remembered was a single phrase shouted by Hargrove as he left the church basement. "If you're not quiet, you'll end up buried with your book." Mendez had that phrase engraved into the official case file. It had taken 40 years, 2 generations of investigators, and a voice recorded just before midnight to finally stitch together the threads. There would be no arrests, no trial, just a ghost with a name, a Bible with a message, and a town forever marked by one man's quiet, defiant truth. The dust had finally begun to settle in Bridge Hollow. The case of Pastor Elijah Benton, unsolved for 40 years, now rested in a new light. His voice, long silent, echoed once more in pews that had since been refinished, in halls that had forgotten him, and in hearts that had never truly moved on. The cassette tape, worn and warped with time, had become a sacred artifact. The town held a second vigil, this time not in mourning but in recognition. For the first time, Elijah's name was no longer associated solely with mystery, but with courage. Detective Carla Mendez stood near the altar, watching the flicker of candlelight cast long shadows over familiar faces. Many of them had once been children in Elijah's Sunday school classes. They carried with them memory, some painful, others tender, but most of all, they carried closure. In the weeks that followed, Bridge Hollow underwent a quiet transformation. The church board approved a plaque to be placed just inside the sanctuary. In memory of Pastor Elijah Benton, a shepherd who spoke truth, even in silence. The tape and Bible were handed over to a historical preservation team from the state archives. A small documentary crew began filming a special on the case, bringing attention to the decades-long search for answers. But not everything felt resolved. Carla received a letter from a woman named Rachel Thorne, a former youth member who had moved away in the late 80s and never returned. In her letter, she explained that Elijah had once confided in her about internal pressure from church elders. He worried he'd let too many things slide. She ended her message with a line that struck Carla deeply. Sometimes it's not the sins we commit that break us. It's the ones we protect. There was something about that, about quiet guilt and the weight of secrets, that stayed with Carla long after the investigation closed. The cemetery, once overgrown and forgotten, was cleaned up by local volunteers. New gravestones were reset. The area where the time capsule was found was fenced and marked with a modest stone cross, Elijah's final resting place in symbolism, if not in body. A church elder who had remained silent for years finally stepped forward during a Sunday sermon. He confessed to mishandling funds in the early 1980s and covering up the scandal when Elijah found out. He didn't admit to any violence, but his voice cracked as he said, "I was part of the machine that silenced him. I did not kill him, but I let him vanish." The congregation sat in stunned silence. Some wept, others left, but a few walked up and simply hugged him, because Bridge Hollow had seen what silence could do. And now it had finally chosen to speak. The story of Pastor Elijah Benton didn't end with justice in a courtroom. There were no arrests, no handcuffs, no newspaper headlines declaring a killer found. But sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with flashing lights or breaking news. Sometimes it whispers through cassette tape static, through a forgotten Bible buried in earth, through a town's decision to finally look backward in order to move forward. Carla Mendez often walked the cemetery paths alone after the case was closed. She wasn't religious, but something about the peace of the Elkhorn grounds drew her in. One evening, near dusk, she spotted something strange. A folded note tucked beneath a bouquet of wildflowers left beside the wooden cross. It read, "He never preached fear. He lived forgiveness. And now, we forgive ourselves." There was no name on the note, but Carla knew who it was meant for. The community, despite decades of unspoken grief, began to rebuild its collective identity. Bridge Hollow High added a module on local history in its civics class, and for the first time, students learned about what had happened in 1983 not as a rumor, but as history. The vigil was held annually now, not in mourning, but in acknowledgement, not just of Elijah, but of the responsibility each person carries, to speak, to see, to act. The church, once fractured by years of whispered doubts and buried truths, found its voice again. A new pastor, Reverend Sarah Price, stood before the same congregation Elijah once did. She began her first sermon by playing the last 60 seconds of his tape. The silence that followed was the loudest moment of the service. For Elijah's daughter, Miriam, now living in Ohio with her own family, the revelation brought conflicting emotions. Relief, yes, but also a reopening of the wound she'd carried all her adult life. For years, she'd convinced herself that her father had run away, that the weight of faith and expectation had finally broken him. But hearing his voice, hearing the quiet defiance, the calm preparation for something he feared would come, gave her a strange sense of peace. "He didn't leave us," she said in an interview. "They took him, but he made sure we'd still hear him someday." The story traveled further than anyone expected. National outlets picked it up. A podcast episode went viral. Even a documentary producer from Atlanta requested to adapt the case for a streaming special. And while Bridge Hollow remained the small town it had always been, its people stood taller now. Not because their pastor had returned, but because they had chosen to return to him. Elijah's story became a parable of sorts, not only about loss and mystery, but about the dangers of silence, the burden of secrets, and the redemptive power of truth. No one ever found his body, but maybe that was never the point. Maybe his voice, his Bible, his courage, those were the things that mattered most. The things that outlived death and decay. Things that, when uncovered decades later, still had the power to change everything. What do we carry when someone disappears? Is it the weight of not knowing? The ache of unanswered questions, or the fear that we'll never truly understand what happened to someone we loved? Pastor Elijah Benton vanished on a humid summer night in 1983. For 40 years, he became a ghost woven into the fabric of a quiet town. A rumor, a legend, a wound too painful to name. But what remained wasn't just absence. It was presence, a presence felt in the empty pew, in the overgrown cemetery, in the pages of a missing Bible waiting to be found. In the end, Elijah's voice returned, not as a miracle, but as a message, not as a ghost, but as a man who knew the dangers of silence and still chose to speak. His words, preserved by time and soil and sorrow, were a final sermon for a town that had once tried to forget. And what they reminded us is simple, but not easy. The truth doesn't always arrive when we want it to. Sometimes it takes decades. Sometimes it hides in attics or graveyards or cassette tapes that someone once hoped would never be found. But the truth waits, it watches, and eventually it finds a way. So what would you have done if you'd found that Bible? If your town had buried something so sacred, so broken, so unresolved? Would you have walked away? Or would you have leaned in, listened, and asked the hardest question of all? Why did we let him vanish? Elijah's story is not just about a missing man. It's about memory, community, redemption. It's about what happens when we stop asking why, and what begins when we dare to ask again. If this story moved you, we invite you to share it. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Was Elijah betrayed by silence, or did he defeat it in the end? Let us know what you think. And remember, the stories we forget are the ones that echo the loudest when they return. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.